I think film's extremely important from a couple of different points of view. For myself as a filmmaker, being able to have the choice to shoot on film, to shoot on celluloid, which is what I love and what I choose to do, that's been under threat the last couple of years, very much. There's been an economic imperative to push digital technology because it's perceived as being cheaper, which it isn't necessarily, but there are a lot of economic interests wanting to sell new equipment, wanting to evolve the industry and make money that way, and they've had a very powerful voice. And so over the last couple of years, filmmakers like myself who wanted to continue shooting on film have been under increasing pressure to modernize, whatever you want to call it. But for me, film will always have this wonderful richness, the analog color it has, the superior resolution, and when film is projected, the way it was originally intended to be seen, the way you shot the film, you project the film, there's a very unique experience for the audience there that they can't get in their living rooms. And I think that's something that's very, very important.
Is it a little bit nerdy? I mean, if we were to take you to a blind tasting and screen several movies at you, are you confident you'd, on the whole, spot the old film stock from the digital?
I'm extremely confident of that, but that is my job, that is my profession. Obviously, I'm aware that we're dealing with relative subtleties, but people often misunderstand just how sophisticated the human eye is and how it develops over time. And so, for example, I grew up in a generation where when you switch on the television, in the 80s and 90s, you could tell within a couple of shots, within 5 or 10 seconds, whether you were watching a feature film being shown on television, a news program, a drama, a television commercial. Everybody's very sensitized to the differences in imaging technology. They might not understand it. They might not be able to say, this is why this looks this way, this is why that looks that way, and nor should they. But in terms of being sensitized to it and it having an effect on the way they perceive the story they're being shown, that's inarguable. That's a very powerful component of what cinema has always been. And when people look at movies and say, well, if we do it more like television, if we use video technology as opposed to film technology, it won't have an impact. A lot of the people who were telling me that 10 years ago are now the people saying that younger audiences aren't as interested in films as they used to be. They're more interested in television, for example. And so I think there's a very real danger with watering down the theatrical experience, watering down the experience of what a film is, that organic, larger-than-life sort of quality that a great film print has. I grew up able to go to Leicester Square and look at these amazing images projected on huge screens. It was incredibly important to me as a kid, and I really want my kids to have that same experience.
Okay, so is this about making sure that film stock continues to be used? Is it also about a sort of conservation role? I mean, I don't know if there's a threat to old movies.
They
deteriorate, don't they?
There's a massive threat to old movies and to the movies being made today. What happened in the history of cinema is a history of people not looking after movies. And there's great work being done by the Film Foundation that Martin Scorsese set up to restore films of the past, to try and find lost films. And when we look back at the way the Hollywood studios and the distributors of the cavalier way they treated some of their films back then, you would think that those lessons had been learned. But the truth is today, particularly with the confusing proliferation of digital technology in the distribution mechanism, you would think that we'd learned the lessons of the past, but the truth is there isn't any stable digital archiving medium. And so really the only way to reliably preserve films for the foreseeable future is on film stock. And that's continuously, or increasingly I should say, being ignored. So when you talk to archivists, the photochemical preservation of films is extremely important. And it hasn't been as sexy a topic to talk about as digitization. So it's the idea that, well, you could raise money, in years past to digitize your archive. Well, that's wonderful as far as access goes. And digital technology has been wonderful for granting increased access to older films. But you can't throw away the photochemical elements. Those are still the authoritative versions of the films, and they need to be preserved very, very carefully. And that costs money, that takes people with great expertise, and it's very important that that not be ignored. We'd all love to believe that with new technology, with new digital technology, a problem has been taken off the shelf, the problem's been solved and we don't have to worry about it anymore. It's simply not the case. We're always going to have to be guarding these cultural treasures very, very carefully.
Okay, do you feel the same way about digital effects? I mean, if I was a director, I might yearn for the days of Francis Ford Coppola where you could send genuine choppers in to Nam and film that. Is it a little bit disappointing to say, well, we'll leave all that to the blokes in the lab?
Very much. I mean, on my films, I try to shoot as much in camera as possible. On Interstellar, my last film, for example, we didn't use any green screens. So when we were shooting inside a spaceship, we had views outside the windows. We produced all that material and we shot it and achieved the effect in camera. And when you're asked...
Even the bit where Matthew McConaughey's tumbling through a sort of space-time continuum, if that indeed is what he's doing.
Indeed. We built a set for that and we enhanced it with visual effects. And visual effects technology has been wonderful for enhancing those things and increasing the vocabulary. But sometimes when you're asked to justify these things like not using green screen, you have to just bring it down to, well, it's so much more fun to do it. It's fun for the actors, it's fun for me. There's nothing more dispiriting than when you turn up to work and there's just a green screen with a couple of actors in front of it. It's really, the magic's not there. So trying to do these things for real, trying to use real locations. I've always preferred real locations to sets for the same reason. There's a feeling of reality, there's a feeling of being somewhere that matters. So, I avail myself of all the latest digital effects technology, absolutely, but we try and always achieve what we can in camera and have as good a time as possible doing it.
Very good. Good to hear. Now, you're famous for somehow marrying a kind of art film sensibility with these big popcorn guzzlers. How do you do that? And what is the knack of bringing big audiences to cinema, do you think?
Well, I wouldn't claim to have the knack for doing that. I've been very fortunate with, the breadth of the audience we've managed to get for some of our films. Ultimately, really all I could say to that was I try not to separate the two things. I try not to separate my love for very sophisticated, esoteric filmmakers, people I grew up watching, like Nicholas Roeg, whose films I love. I try not to separate that side of myself from the side that grew up watching Star Wars and James Bond and loving that. You try to pitch the film in the language that you think it should be made in. You try and think of what's the breadth of the audience you're making the film for. But I don't think that needs to involve dumbing it down or selling it out in any way, because I grew up loving Hollywood blockbusters, and for me it's really a process of trying to recreate that magic, that sense of scale, that sense of immersion in a world that you grew up with. If you can bring that to filmmaking, I think you have the potential to reach a wider audience. With all the films I've made, I felt that really trying to complement the audience's intelligence, trying to engage the audience with something that's new or different, can pay great dividends.
You mentioned Bond. Mendes will be stepping down. Is it time, perhaps this is your next thing, the Nolan Bond, where he travels back in time, or wouldn't you like to grapple with that franchise?
Well, I mean, it's a great franchise and I've grown up absolutely loving it, but they seem to be doing fine without me.
That's not a no. That means,
it's not a no, but it's not a yes.
Barbara Broccoli picked the phone up. Okay. One of your films that I particularly enjoyed was Insomnia with Al Pacino. Quite interesting to make. What are your memories of that? My only regret is that you didn't get a real signature mannerism out of him, unlike Scent of a Woman with the hoo-has going on.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing in working with Al, who is an amazing film actor, I mean, arguably, I would say one of the best who's ever lived. One of the things you learn from him is he would act very specifically for the film medium, and that is to say, he would ask you to do a number of takes. When you were doing a take of a 2-minute scene or something, he would produce a peak of energy or something, and he would shift it take to take. And the reason he would do that is because sometimes he would do something that was extreme or over the top, so that about 30 seconds later he would sort of hit just the right note. And so you have to edit the performance
to sort of G him up.
Well, just something in his process, exactly, to find the correct truth, the correct level of energy for the take. But what it means is, as a filmmaker, you then have huge opportunities in the edit suite, but you've also got a tremendous responsibility to try to be true to his original intention and draw from, if he's given you 12 takes, you're taking the beginning of take 2 and the middle of take 4 and the end of take 8. And that was a very careful process that I really loved doing. I mean, the fascinating thing with Al is he's also a great theatre actor, so he can do it completely differently as well. But he's so knowledgeable about film and film craft. It was a joy to work with him, and I learned an enormous amount doing it.
So you couldn't say, Al, that was fine, the first take's great, it's freezing up here, let's move on to the motel scene.
I could try, but I wouldn't get away with that, no. I mean, the really interesting thing for me when I look back at the dailies on that film is that we would do a lot of takes. We would do 10, 12 takes of anything. But I could have cut the entire film from his first take every time. He was
Is that
always
rare in
perfect,
your experience?
Extremely rare. I mean, he was in almost every scene of the film. He shot 53 days, I think. Every first take was perfect, absolutely perfect. He then explores in all kinds of different ways, in fascinating ways that really let you try different things thematically and let different elements of the story or different layers of the story kind of bubble to the surface. But as far as from a technical point of view, every first take perfect. I mean, he's so on it, so prepared, and you really have to raise your game when you work with him.
Okay, and Batman, a huge success, very dark, very dystopian. Obviously, you collaborate on these films, and not entirely your vision, but is there some sense of that's how you see the way we are now, or is that reading too much into a movie?
Well, I think it's more a question of saying the opportunity you get with working in a particular genre, like the action movie genre, the superhero genre. Working within a genre, it affords you the opportunity to explore things you're interested in or afraid of, neurosis you have, worries you have about the way the world is. It allows you to explore them in a very sort of exaggerated manner, in a way that you can really tap into the collective fears that we have as a society. And particularly in the case of Batman, you have the opportunity through his environment, through Gotham, to really offer a very dark reflection of the society we live in. And with my collaborators, David Goyer, my brother Jonah, at the script writing stage, we certainly were very careful not to be self-conscious in those aspects. So we tried to just write a great story first and foremost, but we also tried to be open to what are we really worried about? How does the world feel to us? What would you be most concerned about? In the case of The Dark Knight, it becomes very much about chaos and anarchy and the breakdown of society and so forth. That way, going through that process, you hope to come with something that will resonate with the audience, that will touch something in them.
Do you miss any of the gags from the old TV series? Do you think you've hit the right gag quotient in those films?
I think you put as much humour in as the tone of what you're doing will sustain. And we were always very fortunate to have Michael Caine, along for the ride to drop, the odd
bomb,
line, the odd funny line, the odd bit of heart, and also Morgan Freeman. We had some wonderful actors in there, but those guys particularly, they lent a degree of warmth to something that otherwise could be too dark, too cold.
Now we're in this august library. It's all about the truth of film. So here and on the record, who's the most difficult person you've worked with in the acting profession? Who's the one where you've stood outside the Winnebago going, come on, pal? Because it happens, doesn't it?
To be honest, as a director, you're really responsible for what that tone is on set. And people will ask me, what was this actor like to work with? What was that actor like to work with? The truth is, great actors, and I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of really, really great actors. They're all different. They all have a different process. And my job as a director is to find what they need from me and accommodate that and get the most out of them. And I pride myself on being able to do that.
How do you do the job? Because there's so much to juggle, isn't there? There's the budget, the weather, the locations, the prima donna who won't come out of the Winnebago, let's say, the schedule, the release date.
How do I do? I mean,
do you sleep at night when you're in the middle of these things?
You sleep just because you're exhausted, from pure exhaustion. I enjoy the multifaceted nature of the challenge. I enjoy having to be an expert on a lot of different things, or having to pretend to be an expert on a lot of different things. One of the things I love about directing is you don't specialize. You have to be able to really think of all the different aspects of the film at the same time. It's also important to surround yourself with collaborators who can take the pressure off certain aspects of it, and casting's a huge part of that. Finding actors. Some of the great actors I've worked with on the Dark Knight trilogy, for example, who, they would recognize that, yes, we're also having to worry about flipping this truck or blowing this building up, whatever. And so their process would be balanced against that. And working with very generous performers was a big part of that. So I really do enjoy the challenge of putting together a lot of different aspects of one project and trying to be in control of that. I mean, it's a really fun thing.
How have you managed to get movies like Memento, Inception, Interstellar through the studio system? Because one remembers stories of the old days that the old guys who ran the studios would look at a film, and if they didn't think it would play in Milwaukee, if it was too clever, they would say, go back to the drawing board so people can follow it. Yours have been tangled, knotty films. How do you get away with that?
Well, I mean, ultimately I've got away with it because the audiences have been willing to come along for the ride. And anytime you make a film like Memento, and the audience comes, even though it's challenging material for that genre and that scale, that buys you some credibility with the people who are going to finance your next film. I was actually doing a talk at the National Film School last night, and somebody put up their hand and said, well, how do you pitch a project like Inception? How do you get a film like Inception made? And I made a joke, somewhat glibly, just saying, well, the first thing you do is you make The Dark Knight, because it made a huge amount of money for the studio, and then you come in with Inception and say, okay, how about this? But even though I said it as a joke, there was a lot of truth to it, because really it was about Warner Brothers showing a lot of trust, and saying, okay, you'll be able to execute on this. And be able to make it comprehensible to an audience. So I think part of what it is being able to communicate how you're going to get this across to the audience when you talk to the studio about it, and not show a disregard for the audience when you're dealing with the studio, because you have to recognize the economic realities you're dealing with. You're spending a lot of money on one of these films where it has such scale and there are such big things that you want to put on screen. You have to be willing to take on the responsibility that is going to play wider, and I think that's been a big part of my relationship with the studios, is really trying to be honest and open about what the ambitions are for the film.
Do you ever have people come up to you and say, I loved Interstellar, Chris, but what was it about? Or can you explain what happens? Because I enjoyed it, but I must admit, I slightly lost the plot. Not the first time that's happened, but do you get that?
I get that sort of equally with most of my films.
Do you?
That is to say, I'll have people ask me that about Inception, for example, and I wouldn't say it'd been asked any more with Interstellar. I mean, different sections of the audience get different things out of the film. So when you try and make a film that has a certain density to it, you do, to a certain extent, split up your audience response. But as long as you're getting something out of it, then we're doing okay. I mean, for me, really, the best kind of film you can make, or the most interesting kind of film you can make, is one that maybe somebody's interested to look at it a second time and get something different from it.
Okay. Do you fancy doing something else, a stripped down thing, something like a rom-com or a musical? If somebody came to you with that kind of pitch, would you go, well, look, I've nailed these time travelling odysseys. Yeah, I'm going to do Singing in the Rain for the new generation.
Well, I sort of never say never, but I am a big believer in being sincere about your passion for something, and I do love all types of cinema. But at the same time, when I come to do a project, I never want to be doing a project to just, for example, to show versatility. I wouldn't do a project for that reason. So I think all the films I've made, I like to think that they're connected in certain ways, but that they're also different from each other. That's as best as I can put it. And so I'd like to continue working along those lines, really with a view, first and foremost, to being sincere in my passion for the project, because each film you take on, at whatever scale it's played out at, it's a couple of years of my life, sometimes more. So you really want to be passionate about what it is that you're doing.
Okay, now here's a dark and controversial thought. If you look at the careers of the great directors, you're nobody until you've had a flop. Anyone can have a hit, but can you have a failure and come back better and stronger? What do you think? You've enjoyed this golden ride so far. I don't know whether you ever look over your shoulder and think, I'm due one about now.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I try really to take on every project individually and look at just that one film. Because if you start to look at it too much in terms of a continuum, thoughts like that would certainly bother you. But it's certainly the case that we all have our ups and downs. I mean, that's inevitable if you stay in the game long enough, so you can't worry too much about that. I think the main thing is whatever the reception to a film you've put out there, good or bad, all you really have to hang on to is your own belief in what it is you've done, that you've done the best you possibly could, and that you really loved the thing that it was that you were doing. I think really that's what's there at bottom. And then as far as how it goes down in the marketplace, well, none of us have any control over that.
Since it's in the air very much, do you have any thoughts to contribute to the debate about sexism in Hollywood at the moment? People are saying, certain leading ladies, that pay scales, for instance, are out of line, and it's still a boys' club on the whole.
Well, I mean, certainly there are all kinds of valid criticisms leveled at the film industry along those lines. Whether or not it's worse than other areas of life, I couldn't say, but certainly scrutiny on the issue is never going to be a bad thing.
Some people have been saying that TV is where it's at now, the box set, the Netflix experience. Who's got the time to go to the movies? It costs a lot of money to take a family to the pictures. What do you think about that TV is the cutting edge, as some say?
Well, it's very interesting if you look back at the history. As soon as TV comes along in the 1950s, people start saying movies are dead, TV's taking over. It's been that way, for generations at this point. I think they're just different, and there are all kinds of wonderful things about TV, but it can't take the place of movies. The communal experience of sitting and watching a 2-hour story unfold with an audience around you, I think that's a very important part of our cultural life, and I think it always will be.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.